Society and our Doug Walch speaker series for the fall. Our friend tonight, Marie Linnabery, has agreed to come back. She is from the Niagara History Center in Lockport, and tonight her focus is on the Niagara County connections to the Pan-American Exposition. Marie, thank you for being with us.
You're going to have to forgive me. I'm going to have to sit. I have a knee problem, and so if I stand too long, not very good. So, well, as Nancy said, I am Marie Linnabery from the Niagara History Center. Prior to that, I worked for 12 years at the Theodore Roosevelt site in Buffalo. I'm at the History Center now for 20 years. Prior to that, it was 12 years at the TR site in Buffalo. And so I've always been interested in the Pan-American Exposition and the implications for what happened there, which we'll be talking about. But it wasn't until I started working up here in Niagara County that I started looking into how Niagara County fit in to the story of the Pan-American Exposition. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. See if I can get this to work correctly. Okay. And it's decided it doesn't want to. Let's see here. Pressing the wrong button. Or maybe the batteries aren't working. Or maybe there aren't any batteries in it. Now that I think about that, yes, Miles.
Yes.
You need to get the batteries out of there. I forgot, one of our employees who always takes the batteries out, and then of course I forget that he takes the batteries out. I suppose it's probably a good thing we don't keep them in there, but I should have thought of that to begin with, so I apologize. But so tonight, as I said, we're going to be talking about some of the connections to Niagara County. Now, John wanted a trivia question, so we'll do that right now. John knows the answer to this, so you won't answer it. Does anybody else know who the painter was that painted the logo? Let's look, if any of the younger people know. Any of the younger people know that? He was from Lockport. Pardon me? Not Joe Allen. No, it wasn't Joe Allen. Are there batteries in there? Okay, so thank you. Any others? I know probably a few people I know here would know.
Lynn knows. I do.
Okay.
Mr. Vandermark.
No.
What is his real name?
No.
Oh, right.
Raphael, that's
Sorry.
all right.
Yeah,
So let's try this again. And I also want to say that I'm glad to see, my husband and I lived in Wilson for a while, so I'm glad to see some old friends, and I'm glad to see some new friends. So it's nice to see people again. So let's try this again. There we go. Okay, so what was the purpose of the Pan-American Exposition? Well, without going into a lot of historical background in the 19th century, there had been times during the 19th century when the relations between the United States and its Latin American neighbors were not so good. And so the idea was conceived to have this large fair to show the cooperation and friendship between the nations of the Western Hemisphere. And so they had already started talking about this in about 1897. They were already starting to plan it, and then 1898, the Spanish-American War starts. And that just sort of threw all the plans out the window. So then, in 1901, they decided to try it again. So, but we're going to go back first to 1897. So let's just, okay, so in 1897, they started to talk about having this great exposition, and they wanted to have it on Cayuga Island in Niagara Falls. Now, Cayuga Island, as you all know, is part of LaSalle, and at that time, there wasn't a lot of homes on there, wasn't a lot of development there, but because of Niagara Falls' proximity to railroads, obviously the hydroelectric power industry, the fact that millions of people already were visiting Niagara Falls, they had a good transit system to get people around the area in addition to the trains. So there were a lot of reasons why Cayuga Island would have made sense to have the exposition there. So there's a map from 1908. You can see Cayuga Island. Of course, LaSalle and Cayuga Island were incorporated into the city of Niagara Falls in 1927. So, but at that point, it was actually their own village, and it was its own entity. It was not part of the city of Niagara Falls at that time. There we go. I have to apologize, this slide is a little different from the others because I changed it and it just didn't come out like the other ones did. But anyway, I wanted to add the house to the picture. That is the home of D.N. Long on Cayuga Island. It is still there. And that is where President McKinley stayed when he came to Cayuga Island for the groundbreaking ceremony in August of 1897. So they did actually have a groundbreaking ceremony right on Cayuga Island in LaSalle. That picture is kind of blurry. It's from a newspaper article, so it didn't come out very well. But you can see that I have an arrow there where President McKinley is standing. So it's kind of neat that the house is still there on Cayuga Island, although, again, today it's all built up with a lot of cottages and things, but that house is still there. Oops, went one too far here. Okay, so this was actually a plan that they had already developed for the exposition, and when you see the later exposition that ended up in Buffalo, you're going to see that this was a much smaller fair than they ended up having in Buffalo, but this was sort of the concept. It may have changed if they ended up having it on Cayuga Island, but this was their initial, so they actually got as far as developing a blueprint or a plan for this exposition on Cayuga Island. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the Spanish-American War took place, and this really put all the plans on hold for the exposition. The exposition was supposed to have taken place in 1899 on Cayuga Island, and then with the war, that just stalled everything. So then in 1899, they started talking again about an exposition. But they were no longer talking about Cayuga Island. They were talking about Buffalo. Now, Buffalo in the turn of the 20th century was the 8th largest city in the United States. So it was a major railroad hub. Obviously, it also had a great transportation system around the city. Of course, by that time, there was electricity being transmitted from Niagara Falls to Buffalo. It was at that point, it was kind of on a limited scale. But because of Nikola Tesla and the alternating current, they were able to transmit the electricity to Buffalo much more easily than they would have been able to use the direct current in Niagara Falls. They were able to use the alternating current to get the electricity to Buffalo. So Buffalo was, as I said, a major transportation center. There were steamship companies coming in, and as I said, railroads, and it made sense. It would be easier to get more people to Buffalo than it would be to get people to Cayuga Island. So that was one of the considerations, but there was also some others as well. So why did they change? Well, there was also some, I don't know, for lack of a better word, some shenanigans going on. Obviously, there were people in Buffalo who knew that the exposition would benefit Buffalo, and so they were really pushing for it to be in Buffalo. But there was this huge piece of land down south of Buffalo on the Lake Erie shore that was pretty much vacant. It was farmland and lake shore. And so that kind of got into the conversation as a possible place for the exposition. So the people that owned the land down there in what was then West Seneca, it wasn't Lackawanna yet. It wasn't the city of Lackawanna, it was the town of West Seneca. They thought, well, you know, we'll sell the land at relatively inexpensively so that the exposition could be held here. So they sold the land to these Buffalo businessmen with the idea that the exposition was going to be there, when in reality they never had any intention of having the exposition there. What they had the intention of was selling the land to the Lackawanna Steel Company. So they sold it to the Lackawanna Steel Company at a profit. So, yeah, and then of course when the landowners in West Seneca found this out, they weren't happy about it, but it was too late at that point. So that area eventually became what was later Bethlehem Steel. Started out as Lackawanna Steel and then became Bethlehem Steel. And Lackawanna finally broke away from West Seneca and became a city in 1909. So that's why you have the city of Lackawanna, but it was originally part of the town of West Seneca. And I grew up right in that area, so I'm very familiar. I grew up on the South Buffalo, Lackawanna, West Seneca border. So where did they end up holding it? Well, they ended up holding it in a place called Rumsey's Woods. Now, Dexter Rumsey was one of the wealthiest men in Buffalo, and he owned a lot of property. But up in this part of North Buffalo, north of Delaware Lake, it pretty much at that point was still pretty much farmland. So, you know, it wasn't very productive or, you know, lucrative, I'll say. So he agreed to lease the land to the Pan American Company, Pan American Exposition Company, and they decided to build the exposition there. Now, Dexter Rumsey was very good friends with John Milburn, who was the president of the Pan American Exposition. His daughter, Mary Grace Rumsey, was married to Ansley Wilcox, who was also a good friend of John Milburn. And so you can see where this is going a little bit, because they knew what they were doing when they were working to get the exposition into Buffalo. So finally, when it was finally decided where the exposition was going to be held, they started to work on it. Now, the exposition was going to be a much larger one, as I mentioned, from the one that was originally supposed to be at Cayuga Island. And one of the most difficult aspects of it was going to be creating these buildings. Now, the buildings, for the most part, were going to be temporary structures. They were going to be made out of plaster, chicken wire, wood. They were not meant to be permanent buildings. So when the exposition ended, the intention was that the land would be cleared and then it would be sold. We'll get to that a little bit later. But there was all of this elaborate statuary that was created for the exposition. And that's what took so long to make, because craftsmen worked for about a year and a half just creating the statuary for the exposition. And when you see some of the pictures I'll show you in a little while, you'll see how beautiful it was. And you look at it and you're amazed to know that it's not permanent. It's not real marble, it's not real stone, it's just plaster. So, they actually actually started physically building the exposition in 1900, so about a year before that. While they were all still working on the statuary and everything, they started actually building the buildings. And the exposition opened, the unofficial date was May 1st, but the official dedication ceremony day was May 20th, 1901. Now, everybody looks at this picture and they see all these men in their heavy coats and their top hats, and it looks like they're walking on snow. But it's not snow. It is just stone or some sort of pavement that they were walking on. But a lot of people, when I worked at the TR site, saw that picture and they'd say, oh my God, it was snowing in May, which it has snowed in May in Buffalo, but it actually was pretty cold that day, but not cold enough to snow. Now, President McKinley was supposed to have opened the exposition that day, but his wife, Ida McKinley, she was very frail. She didn't feel good most of the time, and that particular day, she didn't feel good. So a couple of days beforehand, when she wasn't feeling well, McKinley bowed out. And so he sent his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, to open the exposition. And Theodore Roosevelt came with his wife Edith and his daughter Alice. I'm sure you've all heard of Alice Roosevelt. She was quite a character herself, just like her father. But so anyway, so the McKinleys rescheduled their visit for September of 1901. And there's just a couple examples of some of the tickets for the exposition. So this is the map of the exposition, and you can see how much larger it is than what they were planning on doing at Cayuga Island. And as I mentioned, all of these buildings, well, almost all, there were a few that weren't, but 95% of them were temporary buildings. But they also dug canals. They had like a Venice type of canal system with gondolas. You could take a ride around the exposition grounds. And it was just, if I could go back in time, that would be one of the places I would go. Because to me, it was just such a fascinating place to be. It must have been that, and the most spectacular part of it, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, but would have been the electricity, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So there were a couple of official logos for the exposition. We've already talked about the one on the right. That was created by Raphael Beck, who was from Lockport. His house was on Willow Street. His house is still there, actually. And but his studio was in Buffalo, in the Calumet building in Buffalo. And once a year, on his birthday, he walked from Lockport to Buffalo. That was his birthday present to himself. Every year, just to prove that he could do it. He walked from Lockport to his studio in Buffalo. So, now on the left side is another logo that was used, and that was done by Evelyn Rumsey Carey. And then there was another woman who was Evelyn Carey Rumsey. So I mean, they as you can see, they all married, each other, and so the names got kind of confusing. But anyway, so those were the two logos that were used for the exposition. But the one by Raphael Beck is the one that was most often used on souvenirs. So, the next couple of pictures are just going to kind of show you what the buildings look like in the daytime and then what they look like at night. So, but again, looking at them in the daytime, again, they look like they're made out of stone or marble, something very substantial. But then at night, with them outlined with the lights, that must have been quite a sight to see for people who did not have electricity in their homes yet. Buffalo, by about 1910, Buffalo was starting to get, homes in Buffalo were starting to get electricity. but in 1901, there were some businesses that had electricity, but for the most part, you know, people still didn't have it in their homes, so this must have just been something for people to see at that time. There were 300,000 8-watt bulbs that were used throughout the exposition, and they employed a crew of 12 men who went around every single day and checked the light bulbs to make sure that they weren't out, or if they changed them. So that's how important it was to keep those lights working. Now the electric tower was 410 feet tall, and at night it could be seen, it's said that it could be seen from Niagara Falls, so 20 miles away. Now there's the electric Mohawk Tower down in Buffalo, which is not as high, not as tall, and not exactly the same. But some people, at first thought, you know, would think that it was the same tower, but it's not. They're kind of reminiscent of each other, but that one is a little more round, and this is more of a square tower. But it was absolutely, it must have been absolutely beautiful to see that. Now, in Niagara County here, up on Lower Mountain Road, near Leet Road, in what was called Hickory Corners, was the Pomeroy English Walnut Farm. Now, if you're familiar, the house is still there, but unfortunately, it had a major fire in it within the last year, I believe. And the house is still standing, but I don't know what's going to happen with it. That house was built in 1824 by Daniel Pomeroy. So it's the Pomeroy, and then it was the Mawaka, I'm not sure I'm saying it right, family that has owned it since the 1930s. But anyway, the Pomeroys had an English walnut farm, and they sold saplings from their farm at the Pan American Exposition. So that was another connection that Niagara County had to the Pan Am. Then the Oliver Bedstead Company in Lockport, they had a bed on exhibit, on display there, that was made out of brass and glass, and they had an electric light on the top of it, on the top of the canopy, so that you'd have light in your bed if you wanted. So now their company, their building actually stood until not too long ago. I don't know if any of you were familiar with Walter Cole's, his motorcycle, their business there on Gooding Street. Well, that's where the Oliver Bedstead Company was. They actually started out as a cider mill, and then they found out they could make more money making beds than cider. So they switched it from a cider mill into a bed company. So, yeah, their exhibit was in the Liberal Arts and Manufacturing Building. Now, back to President McKinley. I just got to shift a little bit here. So President McKinley had rescheduled his visit for September 5th, 1901. And right off the bat, things got a little tense because when they arrived at the train station, now the train station was north of the exposition grounds where Great Arrow Drive is up there in North Buffalo. And when they got there, a 21-gun salute was fired in his honor, and the report of the guns shattered the train windows. And so Mrs. McKinley, who, as I said, was already very fragile and nervous and upset about things, she really had a difficult time. So she ended up going to the Milburn house where the McKinleys were going to be staying, John Milburn. So you had a question?
So we're starting in May 1st and now we're September, this is going on this whole time?
Yes, it went, I should have mentioned, it went from May 1st till October 31st.
Oh, wow, okay.
So it was a 6-month fair. I'm sorry, I neglected to mention that. So yes, so September, actually, I should have mentioned too, the weather was not great that year. In July, there was a lot of rain, and because these buildings were just made out of plaster, some of them actually started to crumble, and some of the statuary started to fall down. So they had people that were constantly trying to repair these things. So by September, actually the weather had really improved. And so people were thinking that, you know, the attendance would go up and finally the weather would be good, and then, well, we'll find out what happens. So his wife went to the Milburn house and to rest and calm her nerves down, and McKinley went on to have do a speech at the Pan Am that day, and he spoke before a very large crowd. Just throwing this out there, if any of you go on YouTube and you look up Thomas Edison's Pan Am film, it's amazing. Just go and watch it, and it shows the crowd, it pans the crowd while McKinley is speaking, and it's incredible to watch it. So, you know, when you get home, if you have nothing else to do, just. But anyway, so he spoke on the 5th, and then on the 6th, he spent most of the day in Niagara Falls with John Milburn. He and John Milburn, again, he was the president of the Exposition, and they visited the Niagara Falls Power Company there on Buffalo Avenue, the plant there on Buffalo Avenue. And McKinley walked around Prospect Park, viewed the falls, went down to Luna Island, looked at the falls. Then they rode the Great Gorge Railroad from Niagara Falls to Lewiston. Now, it usually looped around into Canada and then came back around, but McKinley, as a sitting president, there had been no sitting president before McKinley that ever left the country. So he did not leave the country. He just went back from Lewiston, went back to Niagara Falls, New York. So, but again, Mrs. McKinley stayed at I believe it was the International Hotel, while the president went out on all of his jaunts that day. So she did go with him, but she just did not participate in a lot of these things. So then, that afternoon at around 4 o'clock, he was back at the Exposition, and he was shaking hands, greeting people in a reception line at the Temple of Music, the building on the left. In the middle picture, you can see McKinley, and the man standing next to him, a very tall man, his name was George Cordelou, and he was McKinley's personal secretary and sort of a quasi-bodyguard for McKinley. We used to jokingly call him Lurch. But anyway, so he was actually right near McKinley when Leon Shelgas came up to McKinley, was in the receiving line. He had a bandage around his hand, and inside the bandage, he had a gun concealed in the bandage, and when it was his right hand, and McKinley reached out to shake his left hand, and at that point, he shot McKinley. Shot him twice in the abdominal area, and immediately, Shelgas was wrestled to the ground. So the man who wrestled him to the ground was a very tall waiter who had been working at the Pan Am. His name was James Parker. He was an African-American man. And so he was really the hero of this because he knocked Shelgas to the ground, preventing him from firing any more shots. If I had $1 for every person who told us when I worked at the TR site it was their grandfather who was behind President McKinley in line, I could have retired a long time ago. But it wasn't. It was this man named James Parker. So after McKinley was shot, the first thing he said was, "Be careful how you tell my wife." So his first concern was not about himself, it was about his wife. So after the shooting, he was taken. Now Elon Musk was not the first person to have an electric car. They had an electric ambulance at the Pan American Exposition. And they brought him to the exposition. They called it a hospital. It was really no more than a first aid station. So they brought him there, and this was to treat sprained ankles, sunburn, insect bites, things like that. It was not designed for surgery on someone that had been shot. But they did it anyway. At that time, President Garfield, in fact, today's the anniversary of the day he passed away in 1881. But his assassination had been fresh in the minds, even though it happened 20 years earlier, it's still fresh in the minds of people. And what happened with Garfield was, after he was shot, they had waited to perform surgery on him, and then he ended up dying 2 months later. So the idea was, well, if we do surgery right away and get the bullets out, then McKinley will have a chance of survival. But there was some problems. First of all, the chief doctor who operated on him was a gynecologist who was absolutely not familiar at all with gunshot wounds. Now, they had wanted to get Dr. Roswell Park, who was the foremost surgeon in Buffalo at that time, but he was in Niagara Falls tending a cancer patient, and he would not leave that patient until he knew that patient was out of danger. So instead of waiting for Dr. Park, they just went ahead and did the surgery anyway. They did not use, obviously in those days, they didn't use masks, they didn't use gloves, they didn't sterilize their instruments, they probed around with their fingers. I mean, it would give anybody a nightmare nowadays, but this is what they did at that time. So they were able to find and remove one of the bullets, but they did not find the second one. McKinley was rather rotund, and they said it probably lodged in some fat and it wouldn't do any harm. So they just sewed him up, and they brought him to the John Milburn House on Delaware Avenue near the corner of West Ferry Street for him to recover. Well, as you all know, McKinley did not recover. 8 days later, on September 14th, 1901, he died basically of gangrene. They never did find that second bullet, and the area became infected, and he died of gangrene. For a couple of days, right after the surgery, he did start to rally a bit, but then he declined rather quickly. So Theodore Roosevelt was called. He had been up in the Adirondacks. He had been in Buffalo earlier in the week, and he was criticized because some of the newspapermen said that he was too anxious to assume the presidency. He was waiting for McKinley to die so that he could become president. And this really bothered Roosevelt. So he left Buffalo, went up with his family on a camping trip in the Adirondacks. So then it took them a while to find him and to get him back here. By the time they got him back here, McKinley had already died. And so then he was criticized for not getting back here quick enough. So he couldn't win. But anyway, so he was inaugurated in the home of Ansley Wilcox, who was a friend. John Milburn wanted the inauguration at his house, but Theodore Roosevelt did not think that was appropriate because McKinley was lying there dead. So they had the inauguration at the TR site. So, what happened to the exposition? What happened after the exposition? So, on November 1st, the exposition was over with and it was closed. And there was a public riot, basically. People went onto the grounds and took whatever they could cart off with them. And people pulled down some of this statuary and took it home with them. But obviously, because it was made of plaster, it probably didn't last very long anyway. Some of the larger buildings were sold off. I'm going to show you a couple pictures of some of them. But that's what people did. I mean, they just took what they could carry off with them. So they started tearing the Exposition down that November, and it actually took about 6 months. They worked all during the winter to get it down, and by the next summer, it was gone, basically. And that's when they started to, they filled in the canals, and they were starting to get the area ready for a residential neighborhood. And of course, the Rumseys still owned it because they'd only leased it. So they were going to be making a pretty good profit selling these lots for residential properties. So a couple buildings have survived. Now, I think everyone knows that the I always called it the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society, BEX. It is now the Buffalo History Museum, but same place. That building was built as the New York State building at the Exposition, and that was a permanent building. So that one was there, and it is still there now. But there was a small, it was one of those coin machines where you put the penny in, and it makes an imprint on it. So that was one of those coin machines on the Exposition grounds. After the Exposition ended, someone from West Seneca bought it and hauled it back to West Seneca and used it as a garden shed. And then, in anticipation of the 100th anniversary of the Exposition in the late 1990s, they gave it back to the Buffalo Historical Society, and it was restored, and it's part of their permanent Pan Am exhibit now. So that's a building that survived. The Wisconsin State Building also survived, and it's now used as a summer home in Point Avenue in Canada. Now the story was that it was dragged across the lake, but it wasn't. It was taken apart and it was reconstructed. I was fortunate enough to get into that house back in the early 1990s. There was a trip that was arranged for people from the TR site and the Historical Society to go and see this building. And the woodwork inside of it was incredible. It was a very beautiful building. So it's a good thing some of them were saved. There was another one in Michigan that was also saved. It was taken apart and reconstructed in Michigan, but unfortunately that burned down a number of years ago, so that isn't there anymore. Question?
That's still plaster?
No, this was reinforced. When it was when they took it apart, it was reinforced. So it still looks like it's plaster, but it has been sided and reinforced. Although I don't know if it's been winterized because they were using it at that time. They were only using it in the summer, but I'm sure that it probably has been winterized because the winters around here are so bad. So what's still left on the site of the Pan Am to remind us it was there? Well, on Fordham Drive, there's a small rock with a plaque on it showing the approximate place where the Temple of Music was, showing where President McKinley was shot. So that's there. There is a small house on Delaware Avenue that was actually there before the Exposition, and it's still there now, and it was part of the Indian stockade. It had been covered in bark for the Exposition because it was part of, the Indian stockade, but that is still there. And of course, as I mentioned, the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society, which was the New York State building. The Albright Knox Art Gallery, they were building it during the time of the Exposition, but it wasn't finished until 1905, so it really wasn't part of the Exposition. They did have an art gallery there, and some of the art that was in the art gallery at the Pan Am did end up in the Albright Knox Art Gallery, but it wasn't completed at that time. So here is a map where you can see the streets that were cut through. Lincoln Parkway the main street that was cut through, and then all of these side streets between Elmwood Avenue and Delaware Avenue. And this house is the house of a friend of mine. Well, unfortunately, they don't own it anymore. Her mom passed away and they sold it. And she actually lives in Germany now, so she doesn't come back very often now that her parents are gone. But this house is on Fordham Drive, and when she was digging in her garden years ago, she found a small bottle that said Jordan River water on it. And she found out that her house was located, it's hard to see on this map, but there was a attraction called the Streets of Old Jerusalem. And so that's where her house stood, and she found this bottle that said Jordan River water on it. So I thought that was kind of cool. But for years, we heard stories about people who would be digging up in their gardens, or they were having some work done somewhere on their property, and they would find chunks of plaster, and they would find artifacts, and they would find all kinds of things, because when the exposition ended, basically what they did was they just pushed a lot of this debris into these canals, and then they just covered them over with dirt. So there was also a lot of flooding in that area because it wasn't really filled in properly. So people had water in their basements and all kinds of things like that. So, but it's just interesting to be able to dig up in your garden and find artifacts from the Pan American Exposition. So that is the end of the program. So I don't know if anybody has any other questions. Yes, Bruce.
Just one comment. I saw on one of those history programs, the second bullet actually fragmented, and they were demonstrating x-rays at the exposition, but all the doctors were afraid to use it because it would be too dangerous, so they didn't use it. They're trying to fragment it, and that's why
That is correct. They did have, Thomas Edison had an x-ray machine on exhibit there, and they were afraid to use it because of the radiation. They thought that was going to do more damage to him than the bullet. So they didn't ever use the x-ray machine. So yes, and I neglected to mention that, but that is correct, yes. So, okay. Yes?
My understanding is this the subdivision or the residential area that Frederick Law Olmsted divided designed?
Well, it's part of the parkway system that he designed. It's Lincoln Parkway.
Right.
And it started at, I think it was Gate Circle, and it went up. But now, of course, it's cut off by the Skajakwada. They just cut it off. But it used to go all the way up, and it connected with Delaware Park. So yes, that was all part of that system.
Mine actually lives on Fordham on that rock monument.
Oh, okay.
Is down below her, and she said that he designed that whole neighborhood so that many different socioeconomic levels could all live together. So you have, the first road is Nottingham with all the mansions.
Yeah.
And then the next one is Middlesex, they're a little bit smaller. And then the next one is, a little bit smaller homes, and then eventually it gets to doubles.
Yeah, up
And then
around
you
Great
get to
Area.
Amherst Street, and it's actual apartments.
Right.
And
Well, yeah.
the idea was that they would all mix in and, walk the whole community and all of that. And I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah, nowadays I'm sure that a lot of those houses are going for hundreds of thousands of dollars, but yes. But I can see what you're talking about, yes, as the homes sort of got smaller as you went up, and then there are a lot of apartment complexes up in that area on Elmwood, and particularly on Delaware Avenue, yeah. So, but again, the Rumseys owned all of that, and they must have sold it to a development company. I'm not sure who. I mean, he may have designed it, but there must have been a development company that purchased it, and I'm sure that they made some pretty good money on it, so. Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much.